Hi, it's Dwight again. Today I want to talk to you about the economy and politics of the People's Republic of China. In fact, China is such a broad subject that you can't actually escape talking about it much anymore if you're in business. Chinese civilization is one of the oldest and most influential in the world. It goes back thousands of years. Although, as we think about it, modern China, or the first Chinese empire, was formed in 211 BC by the Emperor Qin, who conquered the half dozen surrounding kingdoms, thereby becoming what we now know as China. In ancient and modern times, developed a huge array of sophisticated technologies, simple things that we think about, gunpowder, the idea of pasta, for those of you who are Italian heritage. Uh, the, but after all this sophistication, after all this science, all this technology, why did China not continue to grow at such a pace? Is one of the big questions. I mean, why did the explosive growth and mass industrialization didn't really happen there? It happened in UK and Europe first, and not in China until much later. One reason might be is that China is a very large country, but it also boasts and has always boasted a very large bureaucracy. That bureaucratic authority stifled competition and development of new ideas because they threaten political stability and the status quo. When things change, bureaucrats don't know where they're going to wind up. And if remember, this started off as the first Qin empire. Chinese history seems to indicate that a particular importance of state authority in relations between people, between members of the state. But this meant that economic growth was dangerously dependent upon the whims of political elites, depending upon who was emperor. It might be expanding outwards, it might be turning inwards, it might be adopting new technologies or foregoing technologies. At one point in time, the emperor told the Chinese admiral He to destroy the world's largest shipping fleet. He'd been on voyages of exploration, and the emperor thought that this was a bad influence on China, that all these foreigners and foreign ideas, was not something that they should be doing business with. But if you look at China at the start of the 20th century, overwhelmingly rural, with over 90% of the population living in the countryside. It experienced huge population growth, from around 72 million in the year 1400 to 381 million by 1820, about the start of the Industrial Revolution. But China went into almost an economic stasis through the Qing dynasty between 1644 and 1911. The latter half of the period exactly when Europe, the USA, and then belatedly Japan all industrialized. So they were left out of that first wave of the Industrial Revolution. China was eventually forced out of this enforced isolation and stagnation by exogenous shocks. It found itself economically, militarily, and strategically behind the rising powers, and as such became a victim thereof. It experienced its own version of Japan's famous black ships, Admiral Perry's gunboat diplomacy. When the British gunboat diplomacy opened up the so-called treaty ports in China, followed by the end of the First Opium War in 1842. Those treaty ports remained the only place where China traded with the rest of the world, and it was quite profitable for both sides, but China never underwent any serious economic development even at that period of time. They were still overwhelmingly agricultural. Economic and social change, as unlike other industrialization leading to revolutionary changes, was almost inevitable. You can't stay agricultural and backward forever if you're going to engage in global trade. So a revolution began, throwing out the last Chinese emperor, which, as I recall, you might have seen the famous movie about. But revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen declared a republic in 1911, and the last emperor abdicated in 1912. Education at this point in time was becoming more widely available, and we all know the key that education holds for economic development. But there was also radical political and economic literature that was being widely disseminated as part of the New Cultural Movement. A teenage Mao Zedong came across the writings of Zheng Guanyi, for example, who wrote of the urgent need for China to emulate Western industrial and military modernization, or face a national catastrophe. In 1913, he began to read the giants of European philosophical, economic, and political theory, such as Adam Smith and Karl Marx. What he made of the dichotomy between those two, one only knows, but we also know that he became very enamored with the ideas of Karl Marx and, of course, Vladimir Ivanovich Lenin. In 1931, as part of Japan's rising empire, they invaded Manchuria, establishing the puppet regime of Manchukuo. And that was a huge blow to China from probably a philosophical point of view, that here we were, one of the world's oldest civilizations, and these folks just took a big chunk of our state. A nationalist government based at Nanjing also existed between the years of 1927 and 1937, so there was internal discord in China, which eventually would lead to a civil war. The two sides agreed to cooperate. The Kuomintang and the people and the Chinese Communist Party, or at least not fight each other during this period of time of World War II. But you also need to remember that for those of us who were allied against Japan, our real allies, were the Kuomintang, the nationalists. After Japan's defeat in the Second World War, the two sides decided we could no longer coexist. So the Civil War broke out in earnest. Eventually, it was the Communist Party of China, led by Mao Zedong, that emerged victorious from the Civil War. Some extraordinarily heroic acts took place, like things during the Long March. But what happened then is that the new communist leadership established a one-party state similar to the USSR, complete with all the planning ministries and control of all sorts of social and economic affairs. Mao and the CPC leadership focused on heavy industry to try to emulate the Soviets, to rapidly emulate Western powers. However, it got distracted by entering the Korean War, which, of course, led to a stalemate. In fact, the Korean War never actually ended. We're still under a ceasefire that mostly lasts to this day. And there are some border clashes that happen. But so what happened after that, the vestiges of the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek fled to Japan, or excuse me, fled to Taiwan, and formed their own government. The planning apparatus was set up and developed a series of 5-year plans. 5-year plans are so common nowadays in the Marxist development style that they're almost a shorthand for state planning. Under the plan targets, domestic consumption was kept extremely low and development was prioritized. Demand outpaced supply. Shortage was constant for many goods, which is very common to state socialist models. If you look at Venezuela nowadays, they're running out of things as diverse as toilet paper, some types of food, and even breast implants. State planning almost invariably leads to this kind of thing, and it's a wonder that people still attempt it. But that's kind of a personal commentary. Despite dreadful inefficiencies in the Chinese system, though, it didn't achieve impressive growth. Average annual growth rates around 4.2% GDP per capita between 1950 and 1975, which is fairly extraordinary. Banks were nationalized between 49 and 52, and the People's Bank of China was formed, which is probably the world's largest bank. The system, however, was not as strongly centralized as the Russian system was. The PRC lacked a major transport and communication structure of the USSR, therefore a strong central command control system could not have been developed, so they still have very strong regional governments. But the replication of much of the Stalinist strategies meant that output grew hugely, but at tremendous personal cost to workers and citizens. Their standard of living really didn't increase for most of the years of this development. While the state got big and powerful, the individual workers, did not get any wealthier. Policy-making procedures were shrouded in secrecy, corruption, lack of clarity, problems which truly exist to this day. If you follow the developments in China at all. The opening years of the first 5-year plan, that was up from 1948 to 1953, were broadly successful, but involved private business and a mixed economy. Private business were normally small enterprises, but the commanding heights, that phrase again, was firmly occupied. During this time, Mao pressed on with agricultural collectivization, and private ownership of business became extinguished, in a very polite term. The level of state control waned again in 1956 to 57, with some markets again tolerated under the so-called 100 Flowers movement. And you'll see this pattern repeated. I mean, the Russians went through it a few times, the Cubans. Depending upon how the Cuban economy was doing, the Castro brothers would either allow private industry or not, depending. Apparently frustrated with what he perceived to be slow progress, Mao initiated a great change of policy known as Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was the forced collectivization of agriculture, and as the Soviet experience has shown us, it was a massive disaster. A mass famine reigned from 1959 to 1961. The estimates of the people that died during this famine range up to about 30 million people. Collectivization of agriculture has never been successful anywhere. That's the curious thing. But yet, the ideology of a communist government insists that it must be tried. Around 800,000 citizens were also later condemned for the support of the 100 Flowers era. Remember the 100 Flowers era that Mao himself put in place? He changed his mind. And for agreeing with him, you now went to the forced labor, the re-education camps. They weren't quite prison labor like the Soviet Gulag system. They truly did try to re-educate you to become a productive citizen again. But it meant that you spent a lot of time parroting back Soviet communist dogma and engaging in self-criticism. Relations between China and the USSR started to worsen, culminating in the Sino-Soviet split. It did not help that the USSR sided with India in the Sino-Indian War of 1962. Another grave disruption to China's development was the Cultural Revolution of 1967 to 69, another era of political purges, again involving mass denunciations and arrests, this time led by Madame Mao. In Commonwealth state socialism, it generated significant industrial growth at the macro level at the expense of instituting severe distortion and lack of efficiency at the micro level. State planning systems have an inability to provide consumer goods. I mean, bakeries don't have bread. Cobblers don't have shoes, that kind of thing. Widespread falsification and gaming of the target system, that's the problem with 5-year plans. Attaining the goal is all that matters. And as we talked about, in the Soviet system, if the manager of the shoe factory didn't get enough leather from the tanning works, which was very common, they would game the system by producing all very small number 2 size shoes. They met their quota of 5,000 pairs of shoes, but nobody could wear them. I mean, so that kind of gaming was common. The planning apparatus gives industries and companies no incentive to work efficiently. That it's just meeting the plan. But originally, there was also a very rigid national wage structure, which gave workers no incentive to work. So if there aren't any incentives in the system, we can see why it started breaking down. After some horrific eras, China, like the USSR, eventually laid the basis for an industrialized society. One major weakness was extremely low levels of GDP per capita. You got to remember, it's a very large country, 1.2 billion people. So even as the world's second largest economy, that doesn't add up to much per person. So what happened was Mao died, of course, in about 1974. And Deng Xiaoping was elected chairman of the Chinese Communist Party in 1978. And Deng, well, probably even more hardline than Mao, was at least willing to listen. That if something doesn't work, he was willing to try something new. So he brought about the open door or an opening up policies. But the Communist Party of China nevertheless persisted with authoritarian control of political and culture and insisted on a state-driven technocratic approach, which was much more effective than markets. In order to kind of cover for what the purists would see as backsliding on Marxist ideology, Deng called it socialism with Chinese characteristics, and made the famous phrase that it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, all that matters is whether or not the cat can catch mice. which means he was very much a pragmatist. So new policies were experimented with. There were partial, not exactly privatizations, but market elements were coming up, particularly in the rural areas. Things like farmers markets, are a great way to get people back on the path. Directors of state-owned enterprises were given more autonomy, given greater incentives, and they were allowed to make and retain some of their profits. They didn't have to give it all back to the state. Deng also realized that the over-bureaucratized state machinery was simply not up to running the production process in a modernized economy way. So what he did was created special economic zones in Guangdong and Fujian. You need to also be aware that these provinces were coastal. Therefore, they were home to smugglers who, under the 1,000 years of Chinese emperors and the 50 years of the communist autarchs, doesn't matter. These folks were still smuggling. Didn't matter who was in charge. They were going to do business because this is what they'd been doing for a few thousand years. And so the special economic zones were providing most of the growth for China for a number of years. So they started getting economic growth at large, which is where the story picks in today. The opening of the reform was very cautious, but from the mid-1990s onwards, the reforms picked up pace, and China's industrial development since that point in time has been nothing short of miraculous. It has emerged as one of the low-cost export factories of the world, and now accounts for about 20% of industrial output, manufacturing output, excuse me. But there's still the argument, do you need democracy? Do you need free speech? Do you need free markets in order to, do you need political freedom in order to develop economically? I think that the verdict is still out on that, but some folks have already made up their minds. The Chinese certainly have. So the state-owned enterprises have been waiting into trouble for years. They're terribly inefficient because they're state-owned. The worst part about it is that they suck up most of the investment capital. The Chinese banks have massive portfolios of non-performing loans. Almost all of those belong to the state-owned enterprises, and they're able to go to the large banks in China and say, "We both work for the government. Give us the money." Whereas if you were a private company trying to get an investment for the same project, you probably wouldn't get it, which distorts the investment market. In 2003, the state finally scrapped the guarantee of employment for urban state workers. Chinese workers have few forms of welfare to fall back on. There's not this massive welfare state that we see in Europe, the US, and Australia. The reforms have unleashed market forces, but the party still works very hard to keep control of them. A combination of many models and systems, a mixed economy of state, private, and semi-state actors. But because the state controls the economy, there's still a massive amount of corruption going on. A lot of China's nouveau riche, the new autarchs, the new oligarchs, benefited from so-called insider privatization. They were high up in the party, got favorable loans from the state-owned banks to buy newly privatized companies from the state itself, and have now become billionaires. The base is now broadly driven, or the base of the economy. The most economic growth in China is provided by the private-owned entities, though. For example, 20 years ago, a dozen engineers got together, put together $25,000 worth of capital, and created what is now the world's largest computer company. But there are still problems here. Intellectual property rights. How many of you have bought, a Hong Kong or Shanghai watch, that looks like it was made in Switzerland? Well, it's the same thing with intellectual property, DVDs, Hollywood movies, books. It doesn't really matter. The Chinese keep promising that they're going to follow, the rules of the road, if you will, on intellectual property, but it's not really happening. But one of the things that China's had to cope with and more or less ignores it because the media is never going to call them on this. There's a so-called floating population of internal migrants. Any civilization that industrializes, from a larger agricultural base, is going to have this massive migration of people from the rural areas into the cities. Well, it's not really allowed to happen in China because it's a very authoritarian society. So these folks wind up living, in slums circling the major cities and working unofficially for the large companies. An even much bigger problem, though, is that expanding economic growth to the huge hinterland, particularly in the western parts of China. I mean, people still there are still living on subsistence agriculture. I mean, as when we talked about India, agriculture, primary industries are still the only form of employment out there, and subsistence agriculture, you're just not making enough money to live, or barely so. But summing things up, 600 million people, more or less, have been raised out of abject poverty by China's economic growth, which is extraordinary in human history. About 80 million people in rural China still live in abject poverty, less than $1 a day. That's the World Bank estimates. Over 2/3 of China's rural population are living from farming, forestry, or fishing. That's said primary industries. One of the problems is the Hukou system. I undoubtedly pronounced that wrong. It's household registration program. You're required to register with your regional government, but once you've got that registration card, you can't move. I mean, you are supposed to stay in your province, and if you need to access education, health, the welfare, the pension system, it needs to be done in the province in which you're registered. Well, we talked about the fact that there are a massive floating population. So these folks are actually operating outside the system. And then finally, there's a huge gap in educational standards between the hinterland areas and the major cities. China claims to have 100% literacy rate. I don't buy that just because of the problems that they'd have to encounter to pull that off. But if you grow up in one of the rural areas, and particularly in Western China, your chance of getting a good education are much smaller than they are if you're in one of the major cities. If you're in Shanghai, you're probably going to get a good education. If you're in, Urumqi, probably not. And that's part of the problem, that you've got that 80 million people that they're going to need to be bringing to the system. That long tail is going to be with them for quite some time because, it's Pareto's law. That last 20% is always the hardest to move forward. My biggest problem with the so-called China lobby or the China enthusiasts is that they seem to truly believe that the most likely outcome of China's transformation is that they will attain some sort of peaceful transition to something resembling democracy after years of industrial growth. I think that's probably the least likely outcome, and that's just looking at Chinese history. I think it's more likely that there might be a civil war. Authoritarian states like China are very good at damping those kind of things down, but those old men in Beijing are scared witless by the fact that they oversee 1.2 billion people many of whom are unhappy on a daily basis, and looks to me like a recipe for a powder keg. All they need is their own Marie Antoinette to trigger the revolution. And China's already had a couple of civil wars, and they weren't pretty. But up until then, China will keep forging forward. If you look at their economic growth, it is leveled off. Although they're growing at 4%, which most Western countries would kill for right now. But in order to keep the citizenry happy, they're going to need more than that. And I don't know where that's going to come from. Well, thanks for listening. Talk to you very soon again. Bye-bye.